This is a Culinary Conversation, newspaper recipe exchange columns as early social media by Kimberly, Wilmot, Voss, presented at the 3rd Food Studies, October 15th, 16th, and 2013. For decades, newspaper food sections served as an important purpose for home cooks and restaurant fans. Readers wrote letters and called the food editors on a regular basis. These food sections were made thick with the recipe store coupons and new appliance advertisements in the 1950s and the 1960s. For example, at times, the individual food section was between 50 and 60 pages. The food section of one newspaper, published the week after Thanksgiving, had a food section that was as big as 90 pages. Food news originated in the women's pages, which is typically narrowly defined as fashion and food household pages at metro dailies across the country. Few of the food sections have received much historical examination despite the important role they played in their individual communities. Newspaper food sections have been overlooked as nothing more than a collection of recipes and plugs for local grocery stores and other advertisers. Yet some have described the food sections as being significant in the story of food. These food journalists wrote about topics such as food safety, foreshadowing the problems with food contamination today, as well as consumer issues that would have run counter to the interests of advertisers who funded their section. This is how Ann Criswell described her career as a food editor at the Houston Chronicle. You may be surprised to find that a food editor's life isn't all champagne and caviar. There is a constant stress of deadlines, keeping up with and explaining to readers scientific and nutrition advancements that can change from hour to hour, learning about food safety, production and agricultural phenomena such as genetically altered food, and having to master new computers and print technologies, often while on deadline. It is worth noting that some critics may have viewed articles about food products as a form of advertising, but it was not true to most of the editors. To these journalists, the introduction of new products needed to be evaluated and explained to their readers. The Chicago Tribune's Ruth Ellen Church wrote in 1955 that the changes in the food industry and available products over the previous decade were, her words, revolutionary. She continued, "Fully a third of the products and foods we buy now at the supermarket were not even in existence 10 years ago. Instant puddings, cake mixes, instant coffee, instant dry milk, detergents, the wide array of frozen and prepackaged foods." Other articles in the food section approached food through societal elements such as the role of poverty and nutrition that went beyond just recipes. Yet that is not to dismiss the value of recipes, which represented a changing American appetite following World War II and the impact of women working outside the home. The most popular requests from newspaper readers to their food editors were for recipes. This was a way for an editor to understand her community and interact with readers, just as we do today with social media. In 1951, Journalism Industry Publication advised, "The food editor of a newspaper, who should be thoroughly familiar with the tastes and dominant food interests of her readers, can win and hold the readership by providing the recipes for the housewife in her constant quest to put dinner on the table." And that quest could include a mix of high-end dishes and everyday foods. In 1952, Church indicated that readers of the Chicago Tribune requested the following: recipes for French pastry, Italian cannoli, East Indian curry. They want to know how to cook pheasant and wine and how to make rich, extravagant desserts. But they also want to know how to fix the everyday foods such as potato salad, coleslaw, bread pudding, and corned beef hash. The food sections were popular with the newspaper readers. For example, Prudence Penny, a pen name used by several food writers, began her reign in 1920 with quick success. During her first year on the job, the writer for the New York Daily Mirror answered more than 70,000 letters addressed to Prudence Penny. When food writer Clementine Paddleford started at the New York Herald Tribune in 1935, her section received more than 78,000 calls and letters from readers. In the 1970s, the food section of the Detroit News received hundreds of letters a week. In Spokane, Washington, according to a 1973 article, more than 20,000 calls came in each year to food editor Dorothy Dean, another popular pen name. According to Cleveland food editor Janet Bay French, her responsibility was to the entirety of her audience. "I believe that food copy should and could reflect every ethnic and racial group in the Cleveland area, and that we should cover food broadly. I think that food sections were an ideal way to showcase the everyday cultures of our citizens in the community." Orlando Sentinel managing editor Bill Dunn said of his food editor Dorothy Chapman, "I know of no other person on our staff over the years who's done more for readers. She has a real bond with them. To them, calling Dorothy to ask a question is like going door to door to borrow a sugar or egg." Denver food editor Helen Donegan's work has been described as a conversation between people who love food. One of the readers contacted the newspaper upon Delegan's death. "I could honestly say I cried at the news," she related. "I felt I knew her personally, even though we never met." This research builds on the work of culinary historian Laura Shapiro, who examined food sections of newspapers. In her book, Something from the Kitchen, she noted that an important source for food history and home cooks was the food section of newspapers. She wrote that this was because, by virtue of their place in the community, they seemed to likely reflect fairly closely the needs and habits of their readers. "And one of my favorite bits in the paper I studied were the recipes sent in by readers themselves," Shapiro continued. In one example, Shapiro examined the content of the Boston Globe's cooking column, Confidential Chat. The editor of that column in the overall food section was Dorothy Crandall. She had a degree in home economics and served as food editor of the Globe from 1953 to 1973. One of the stories she's best known for was a process of cooking a roast underneath the roof of her car. The meat cooked inside her car as she drove from Essex Junction, Vermont, to Boston, Massachusetts. The newspaper food section needed to appeal both foodies who appreciated gourmet cuisine and those who simply wanted a quick and easy way to get dinner on the table each night. As a result, newspaper food sections typically featured three kinds of recipe columns. One, a reader looking for a long-lost recipe, and the newspaper asked readers to help out. Two, a reader is requesting a recipe for a dish from a local restaurant, and the food editor tries to imitate it. Or three, a reader is contributing a favorite recipe, such as one for Christmas cookies. Top recipes often were printed because of reader demand. For example, Marie Dugan, food editor at the Journal in Lincoln, Nebraska, said she had to reprint the recipe for spiced peach jam nearly every year. In 1962, Kay Savage wrote that her At Your Request column had resulted in 365 recipes each year for the past 25 years. These popular recipe exchange columns in the 1960s and 70s were published in newspapers across the country and provided an appreciated understanding of the home cooks and their regional dishes. Eleanor Usman's column ran for more than 3 decades. Honoring home cooks and recipe exchange columns. A case could be made that recipe columns and the cookbooks that came from those food editors were an early form of social media, which linked the food journalists with the home cooks of their communities. After all, women often communicate with friends and family by sharing recipes. New York Times food writer Amanda Hesser observed in 2010 that newspaper, quote, are really in the business of community building, end quote, particularly so in the food pages where readers have been so integral, where they contributed recipes or featured in news stories. Church wrote to a Chicago Tribune readers in 1950, "You, dear readers, are always losing your recipes. That's all right. Go ahead and call us or write. We'll find the recipe for you if it was ours. That's what we're here for." The newspaper food editors received dozens of letters each week. Mary Hart's column Ask Mary in the Minneapolis Tribune was so popular that a 1978 tabulation of mail received by Tribune columnists listed advice column Ann Landers with 763 letters, while Hart racked up 1,056. The food editor's phones rang regularly with food questions. According to Carol Haddix, who worked in the food section of the Detroit Free Press and the Chicago Tribune, of the calls, many were asking basic questions: can I freeze this, or is this safe to eat? Occasionally, I would get calls for a whole menu from someone's dinner party. It would amaze me that writing so many articles on food safety or basic cooking techniques, the question on those topics kept coming in. I had to continuously remind myself that no matter what, no matter how often we run that chart on safe thawing of a turkey, there's a whole new generation of cooks out there that have no clue. At the Omaha World Herald, food editor Maud Kuhn said she answered between 60 and 75 questions each day. Some were about fashion and etiquette, but most were about food. With her home economics background, she could answer most questions on her own. Yet she was stumped by how to cook some foods, such as inquiries about grilled rattlesnake, turtle, and blackbirds. Sometimes the questions veered into other areas, as some callers, in her words, really were just lonely and wanted to talk. In the 1950s, Denver food editor Helen Messenger initiated the popular food column that ran in the newspaper's Sunday publication, Empire Magazine, called Munching Through Denver with Messenger. Charleston News and Courier food editor Charlotte Walker wrote a column for readers looking for misplaced recipes called Loved and Lost. In one 1968 column, a reader was given a vanilla French toast recipe, while another reader requested recipes for gingerbread. Joanne Falshay began penning the Fort Worth Star Tribune's culinary Q&A column in 1963, known as Cups, Cooking Up a Storm. She wrote under the name of Jacqueline Jones. In 1966, Houston Chronicle food editor Ann Criswell started the column Looking for Cooking, which she described as a backyard type of discussion about cooking. It was a chance for home cooks to enter the public sphere. St. Paul Pioneer Press food editor Eleanor Osman initiated a recipe column this Sunday in 1968 that ran for many years. She wrote about her family's love of a certain dish or disaster that she had created in the kitchen by accident. Her readers wrote in often, and Osman quickly learned what they wanted to know about. Readers, she said, loved my flubs. I didn't promise to be scientific. I didn't promise to be perfect. Some residents complained later that they missed hearing about her mistakes as she became a more proficient cook. The Recipe Exchange column, Dear SOS, began in the LA Times in 1961. The intended audience was mostly homemakers who were curious and innovative, but limited. Thousands of requests for recipes came in each year, ranging from old favorites to restaurant dishes to culinary memories from the Los Angeles cafeteria desserts. Cecil Fleming answered the request in the 1960s, and later it was Rose Dosty. The column is still running in 2013 with the name Culinary SOS. Several cookbooks have been published based on that column, including one that was based on Los Angeles area restaurants. The Kansas City food column, Come Into My Kitchen, turned 50 years old in 2005. At the time, the newspaper's food editor wrote, "From suet to sun-dried tomatoes, the Star's popular column chronicles the home cook's ever-changing tastes." Food editor Irma Young began the column in November 1955, and scrapbooks of the weekly column reflected the change in food trends and technology over the years. For example, a 1970 column included a recipe for a 6-can casserole. The Philadelphia Bulletin had an early food column, Between Neighbors, that appeared for decades. The section's editor was Frances Blackwell, which was really a pen name for Mary A. Hammond, who began in 1929. She was at the paper for so long she eventually admitted that she no longer tested recipes from the readers she knew so well. She had trusted their culinary skills, and some of those recipes she received were from the grandchildren of her first readers. The Orlando Sentinel featured the longtime food column, Thought You'd Never Ask, which was penned by food editor Dorothy Chapman. The recipe request feature included dishes from restaurants, especially those from the theme parks. The column ran for more than 3 decades and was the oldest continuous local column in the Sentinel. Former Disney publicist Suzanne McGovern said of Dorothy, she would request a recipe for the column, and our yield would be for hundreds, not for a household of 4. I would have to break it down with the chefs, and she would grill me about it until I got it just right. So in conclusion, newspapers have a direct connection to the community that a national magazine does not. Food editors have largely writing about local stores, local restaurants, and local home cooks. For example, the Akron Beacon Journal food editor said of her role, "The newspaper food editor is a homemaker's best friend, mother, confessor, and mentor. Mrs. Jones calls us when she doesn't understand a recipe from a national magazine or when Graham Kerr talks about clarified butter. Mrs. Jones doesn't call that magazine or the TV station. She calls me." The dishes that these food journalists wrote about continue to circulate today in newspaper exchange columns and on food blogs. For example, on the website for Oprah Magazine is Charlotte Observer food editors Eudora Garrison's recipe for sherry chicken salad sandwiches. In another example, Los Angeles Times food editor Jeannie Volz's recipe for green corn tamales can be found on the Food Network website with a note giving credit to her acclaimed book, Barbecued Ribs, Smoked Butts, and Other Great Feeds. Volta's book was one of the first to establish barbecue as a cuisine worthy of valuing. Her take on barbecue was likely because she was not burdened by the food hierarchy of culinary cuisine. She simply saw an untold story. It is worth noting that advertising and public service are not the same thing. In his job interview for the food editor position of the New York Times, Craig Claiborne was asked by an editor whether his approach to food was news or service. He responded by calling his work to be service. Quote, "There's very little news of food that is all that interesting. Recipes are." It is safe to say that most newspaper food editors saw their values as both as public service and as news. They wanted to report food news, and they wanted to help their readers with their cooking questions. The journalism that food editors practiced in the 1950s and the 1960s in their food columns was an early example of social media in which they connected with their readers, both in person, on the phone, or by going out and going into their kitchens. Thank you.